For this year's Gartner Bake-Off, we were asked to investigate the likelihood of more frequent flooding events worldwide and to see if there's any mitigation strategies governments could take to reduce the risk of flooding disasters. First, let's take a look at the data we pulled together to analyze this topic. We started by pulling in data related to the OECD river flood risk indicators, which looks at how many people live in flood-prone areas and how much built-up area there is that is at risk of flooding. We brought in information about major flooding disasters for the last 100 years, information about major dams worldwide and when they were built and in what river basins, and some additional supporting information about countries in terms of their historical populations and other supporting things like their area, so we could look at population density. Finally, we also pulled in the GHCND weather station data, and this is daily data from 120,000 weather stations worldwide, and it has over 1 billion weather measurements looking at precipitation, snow, temperature, and so we could look at, are there any trends in precipitation that might be interesting? So let's start by looking at some of the results of the analysis and how we prepped that analysis over time. So I'm going to switch to the Power BI service. And here you can see I'm in Power BI Home. And one thing I always like to point out in the Power BI Home is that we recommend content to users based off of not only what has been featured or promoted, but also their social graph. You can see Arun is in my management chain. This is a dashboard that he opens, that I open, and Power BI is intelligently recommending the best content for me to get started with my analysis. And here's one of these data sets we talked about, this daily weather station readings from the GHCND. So let's open this data set, and I want to get started with some analysis to start understanding our findings. Now, I could analyze in Excel, so I could connect Excel up to this data set and create a pivot table that's automatically connected, which is a great way to get started using the familiar interface of Excel. But I actually want to go ahead and auto-create a report from this data set. So I'm going to click Auto-Create. And this is going to use some built-in AI to go look at all of the data. And again, this is over 1 billion rows of data. And we're going to statistically analyze the data to find the most interesting charts to add to a report to help you get started with your analysis. And you can see the total number of precipitation measurements, again, over 1 billion precipitation measurements over time. And right away I can see the first measurement was in 1781, and then over time, as more weather stations have been added, the number of weather measurements is going up and up and up, and then I have less data for this year, so it kind of drops off. But I can get a sense for my data really, really quickly to get started with my analysis. Now, we can see the lowest temperature recorded was actually going down, the total precipitation going up. This is more of a function of the number of weather stations. So the first thing I wanted to look at was to flip this around and look at a different measure. And something that is kind of interesting to think about over time is the maximum precipitation measured. So we can see right off the bat, there's this really spiky trend, and this is worldwide. What was the most precipitation measured on one day at a weather station worldwide? And it turns out if you dig into this data, this was one of the first insights we found, and as we dug into this a little bit more, it does turn out that the frequency of major deluges of rainfall is actually going up. So over time, there's been an increase in the number of big rain events, which of course would lead to an increase of the risk of flooding. And using Quick Create, we call this Quick Create or Auto Creative Report, was a great way to find some initial insights to get started with this data. We also generate a nice narrative summary of some of the information you're looking at. And of course, I can cross-highlight, so if I click here, I can filter down. It turns out if I just click on this year in 2002, I can see there's 8 million weather measurements for that day. And again, I'm slicing and dicing across 1 billion rows of data just in seconds here in Power BI. But now that I have something interesting to look at, let's switch over to Power BI Desktop and continue our analysis. So here I'm in a blank canvas in Power BI Desktop. And so let's start seeing if I can understand what's going on with these flooding trends and see if this increase in the major deluges of rainfall is doing anything to the number of floods or the number of people that are being impacted by flooding. So to get started, I'm just going to ask a question. So again, Power BI has a natural language capability built in called Q&A. This just allows you to quickly use natural language to start exploring your data and adding charts. And the first question I want to ask is, how many people have died from flooding over time? I can see this really interesting chart where earlier in the 1900s, there were lots of these massive, very devastating floods that took a heavy toll on people's lives around the world. But we can see that most of these major floods actually have ceased since the 1960s. That's really interesting to understand because, perhaps there's more flooding going on, but the impact to people seems to have dropped. And so let's dig into this a little bit more and see if we can understand it a little bit better. But before I go any further, anytime I see a real spiky line like this, one of the things I like to do is add a measure for rolling average to try to smooth out some of these lines. And now in Power BI, there's a feature in preview. It actually uses Azure OpenAI. This is using essentially the same technology as ChatGPT and Bing Chat, where I can actually go in and use natural language to just describe the measure I want to create. In this case, I want to create a 5-year rolling average for the number of flood deaths. And just like that, I can click Generate, and that's going to go ahead and generate the DAX script for this rolling average. And this is one of the patterns that works really well with this quick measure in natural language. And this is actually a pretty complicated DAX measure. And now I don't necessarily have to know how to write this on my own. I can just describe it. It looks at my schema and gives me the measure. I could click Add to my model just to save a little bit of time. I've already done that. So I'm going to look at my rolling average here, and I can just add this right to my chart. And just like that, I've created this really interesting measure. And again, it's a great way to be way more productive. And really, the Azure OpenAI integration, obviously, we're so excited about that. We have a bunch of amazing things coming, and we're really, proud to have gotten this first feature out the door even, last year, so we can start, understanding the impact of this large language technology. But let's keep going with our analysis. So I'm going to ask another question here. I'm going to say, how many people are exposed to flooding? And I can see that there's 735 million people estimated to be exposed to flooding. If there's a 100-year flood, this is how many people are at risk of that at any given time. And I might say by country. And I can see how that's broken down by country. And it turns out this has been going up over time. Obviously, more population has been growing. And if I click on, say, China, I can see, again, very spiky, big, very devastating floods historically, but less currently. Similarly for India, we can see for Bangladesh, the same thing, where although there's a more recent very bad flood in Bangladesh, I think that's that spike right in here. But for the most part, we've seen, historically major floods and less more recently. Now, there's one other way that I like to analyze data in Power BI, and that's using smart narratives. When I add a smart narrative to the sheet, it's going to look at all the data that I have in the sheet and try to generate a narrative related to that data to help me understand what's going on in the data. And here you can see the narrative starts out, it's talking about the trend and just giving me some basic insights and statistical information. It's saying that between 2000 and 2020, India had the largest increase in total population exposed to flooding risk, while the Russian Federation had a decrease. And that kind of maybe looks like population trend. But there's one last insight here that the smart narrative found, which is across all of these countries, Bhutan had the most interesting trend in people exposed to flooding, which is it went down from 2000 to 2020. It went down by 44%, meaning a fairly substantial decrease in the population in Bhutan that was exposed to flooding. What could cause that type of change? Well, I think it also probably has something to do with the change in this spikiness, and that's the number of dams that exist worldwide. So I'm going to look at the number of dams, and I'm going to go ahead and add that to this first chart here. So I'm going to drag that to the secondary axis. And you can see that probably a pretty strong correlation. I would even venture to guess there might be a causation here, that as worldwide we started building more dams, the incidence of these large loss of life flooding events really decreased, which logically makes sense. And if we look at a place like China, we can see that as these dams were deployed on major river basins like the Yellow River and the Yangtze, there's I think a pretty clear impact that said as we started protecting more people with dams, the loss of life from flooding dropped off quite significantly. So that's a really interesting insight. Now, we can continue playing with data in this way and doing additional analysis. And what we went ahead and did and built a beautiful report here in Power BI. And one of the great things about Power BI is you can really visualize your data and create really beautiful interactive reports. Here I've got a globe map that I can animate and look at different regions and just kind of navigate around. I've got some of these key statistics, and again, looking at some of this flooding data. And so again, if we look at Asia, we see this very strong correlation between these massive floods and the number of dams. So that's probably a pretty reasonable flood mitigation. I do find it really interesting to see one of the insights that I thought was really interesting is if you look at Egypt here, everybody lives in the kind of Nile floodplain, so actually over 50% of the population in Egypt actually lives in a flood-prone area. It's kind of interesting to think about. But we can keep navigating the data here, so we put some additional tabs where maybe I want to look at the area exposed to river flooding, and look at some data bars and trend lines. What's the list of the major flooding events that we had in our data set? And finally, we can look at key influencers, which was one of the things we were asked to look at in the script for the bake-off. And in this case, there's not a ton of influencers looking at say flooding deaths, but we did have this information about dams and could actually start quantifying some of the factors that caused the number of flood deaths to either increase or decrease. And we can see, obviously if a river flooding frequency goes down, less people are going to die from floods. There's less flooding, at least that's what the data set found. And then if the number of dams in the country, the year of the flood, goes up, the number of dams goes up, the number of people impacted by flooding went down, and this attempts to quantify that change, which is kind of an interesting way to think about that mitigation strategy. And so this is a quick preview of the interesting analysis we can do and to try to understand the risk of flooding and the impacts from it. But now I want to switch back and take a look at how we did some of this data prep. So I have my kind of data prep in process workbook here, so I'm going to switch back over to that one. And let's go ahead and look at how we did our data preparation. So first of all, Power BI can connect to hundreds of different data sources, everything from Access to Zucchetti HR. And as I mentioned, we connected to a wide variety of data sources. And the first one I want to take a look at is this flooding disaster data, and talk about how we did some of the data prep here. So a lot of this data can be kind of messy and need lots of transformations to get it into a form for analysis. And fortunately in Power Query, no matter what data source I'm connecting to, I get the same rich interface with tons of user experience options to really understand my data. You can see the data validation here at the top for understanding the cleanliness of a column. And I've got all these great UI features. The first one I want to use for doing data transformation is actually adding a column from example. This is a huge time saver because all I have to do to transform my data is just provide the output examples that I want. In this case, I've got a country or a region name followed by the ISO code, and I might want to extract that out so I can join my data with other data sets. And in this case, I can just type in example, SVK. Now you can see also some of these countries had like Bolivian Republic of Venezuela, so it wasn't able to match the pattern. It's actually a pretty complicated pattern. Fortunately, I can just provide one more example here for Venezuela, and now it's actually picked up the pattern here of what I'm trying to do, and it's created that function here at the top. And if I click OK, it's going to add that to the pipeline of data transformation steps I'm using on this file. And this pipeline of transformation steps is very useful because it means I can rewind, edit, understand exactly what I did for my data preparation. Now I'm going to do this add by example one more time. I'm going to click on the year, and this works for text values. I can also do it with other data types. In this case, I have year, which is a numeric data type. Maybe I want to add a grouping for 2020 by 2030. And just like that, it's created this new range grouping based off of my data. So I have kind of decades listed out here, 2020 to 2030, 2010 to 2020, and so on and so forth. Again, just by typing an example, it created that new data transformation for me. And so I did this process across a bunch of different data sets. And as I finished this up, I could merge these queries together if I wanted to bring them into a single table. In this case, I didn't need to do that because I could just load this into the tabular model and create a rich semantic model in Power BI Desktop. But I have the ability to merge data together if I want and use all of these over 300 data transformation options built into Power Query. One last capability I do want to highlight. There was some data that we were able to have that was the description of these flooding events. So in this case, there's a flood in China's Henan province with some details about that. And right built into Power Query are some AI insights such as text analytics. I'm going to click on text analytics. And what this allows me to do is to take text, and if I want to do sentiment analysis or key phrase analysis, this is just built in to Power BI and Power Query, and is a very rich way, again, just to pitch the column that I want, and I could say what's the sentiment of it, what's the language of it, or in this case, extract key phrases. And so I can see from this description what are the different things that are being talked about, which is a great way to bring analysis not only to numerical data, but I can also do it with text data as well. And even pictures and images, where I can start doing recognition of what's inside of an image and then using that inside of my analysis. So I've gone ahead and done this data preparation for the import data sources I want to use. And so I can import that data into my model. And we saw that was the model I was using for some of my analysis. But there's these other two tables here, and I wanted to highlight them. They're highlighted in a different color. These are actually direct query tables from a different data set. And what I went ahead and did and created a composite model that was joining together the data from this GHCND. Again, this is over 1 billion records of weather measurement data in this table, and the related station metadata. And I don't want to import this into Power BI Desktop. I actually did import this into Power BI Desktop. Processing and Power Query took quite a few hours every time I wanted to do it. But instead, it was a lot more convenient to model that out the way I wanted, put it into a data set, publish to the Power BI service. And then this is just an example of how I could use a composite model to bring this together to go ahead and build a report. And I do want to highlight, when I want to do that composite model, I can just hit this Find Data in my organization button, which brings up the Data Hub right here inside of Power BI. The Data Hub is the catalog of all the data sets and data marts I have access to inside of Power BI. I can see whether they're promoted or certified. I can even see external data from external tenants that have shared data with me. So right here in Power BI, I can find all of the data that I want to work with and start again. In this case, I'm creating this composite model, which is a mashup of local imported data and external data, and then as I query this data, we figure out how to send the queries to the right place. So as an analyst, I can just use this kind of as a source of truth model published on the service. So finally, when I'm done with this model, I can go ahead and publish it. So let's go look at that. I'm going to click over let's click to the Data Hub. And we can see in the Data Hub here all of the data sets that I have access to in the Power BI service. We can see things that are promoted and certified. And if I click into the data set that we were just playing with, it's published, I can edit and manage the endorsement. I can see the tables that are available. And I can also then view the lineage view for this model. So this lets me see what are the sources that are being used by the data set, and then understand any downstream reports or artifacts that are being connected to this. And so I can think about, if I'm making a change to my data set, how is that impact going to ripple through to these different changes. Finally, I want to show a couple of the ways we can share and collaborate on insights in Power BI. This all starts in Microsoft Teams. So now I've switched over to Microsoft Teams, but I'm still looking at the Power BI home experience, and that's because we've fully baked Power BI into Microsoft Teams. Here you can see in the left-hand rail the Power BI app. We actually have many organizations that have taken this Power BI app and pinned it in Teams for all of the users in their organization. And that means data and insights is always one click away for everybody in their organization. It's a great way to evangelize data and really drive a data culture. So I can come in here, I can find that same report that we built and were looking at earlier. I can open it right inside the context of Teams, very convenient. I don't have to teach users to switch contexts or learn new tools. They can just stay in Teams and work where they like, and it's still fully interactive. And maybe I want to come back to the insight here about Egypt having such a large percentage of people at risk of flooding. And maybe I want to collaborate on that insight with my team. So I can just click Chat in Teams. And I'm going to click the channel that we're kind of been working on for the bake-off. Hey, check out this insight about Egypt. And then when I share this, I could share it with an individual or a set of individuals, or I could share it into a Teams channel. And that link that's going to get posted will actually bring people back to the same bookmark here in Power BI, or the same view that I have right now in Power BI, so they'll get the same state that I have, so they can see this same insight. So actually, let me switch over to that Teams channel. And so here you can see, I've done the demo a few times. So I can see all this conversation thread being posted to the channel. I also could take that report and pin it within the team's channel. And that means this report is now embedded where my team works, where our files are, where we collaborate. I could even pin this inside of a meeting so that this report is available, say, in a weekly meeting. So everybody always, again, has data one click away. One other thing I can pin in here is our scorecarding functionality. So I made a quick scorecard based off of some of the min and max records from that daily weather set data. And again, a scorecard is a great way to define the targets and key metrics that you want to track. And again, drive a data culture because with these metrics, not only can I define targets and goals, I can do check-ins and take notes to really drive a process around the data that I like. If I wanted to, I could also subscribe to either a report or a scorecard so it gets delivered as an email on a periodic basis. I could also integrate with Microsoft Flow so I could create workflow process based off of how data changes. Again, thinking about how we integrate data and insights into everything that we do. Finally, I'm going to come back to the Power BI service here. And there's one other report that we created, is this beautiful infographic here. And a little bit different take on the same data, still interactive, but kind of presenting the data more in an infographic way. And I want to show one last capability, which is how easy it is to go ahead and integrate this data into a PowerPoint slide. And let me clean up from the last time I did this demo. Make it incredibly easy to insert interactive data and visualization elements into PowerPoint. So Power BI is now fully built into PowerPoint. So I can just come in here and say the Power BI button, and I'm going to paste that URL to that report, and I'm going to click Insert. And just like that, I now have a fully interactive data visual integrated into my PowerPoint. And this works with shapes and objects, so I can put this, works with animations, and again, gives me a fully interactive way. And this is a great way to drive meetings. We have another really cool feature built in where I can generate some data insights about the report right here in PowerPoint. This is going to call into our smart narrative functionality, generate a smart narrative about the data that's found in this report. This is a really convenient way to kind of extract some values. Maybe there's a specific insight that you want to share, and you can kind of format these as you like. And all of a sudden, really a big time saver for getting this information right the way I want to do it inside of PowerPoint. And of course, most importantly, it works in presentation mode. So if I come into presentation mode and I start cross-highlighting, I can do everything here, just a couple clicks right inside of PowerPoint. I've got one other slide included with this other visual. And again, this is a great way if you're running a monthly or weekly meeting. Instead of each week having to copy paste this data into PowerPoint, why not have something connected right into PowerPoint? So hopefully this, obviously, the Gartner bake-off demo, we only get a couple minutes for each of these demos. I actually have to give the demos in a couple days, so wish me luck. And hope you found this insightful and interesting, both in terms of the capabilities of Power BI and some insights about flooding and flood risk mitigation. Thank you.